I hope a few more show up. Great, thank you. Okay. Um, so there's some good momentum and side conversations and other activity coming out of all this work, which is great. Um, as we're coming in, why don't I give Ali a chance to go ahead and set us up with some comments on Spanish interpretation, and then we will jump in.
Great, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos, todas, y todes. For these sessions, we do provide language interpretation. We value language justice and want for everyone to be able to participate in this series in the language in which you feel most comfortable. We call that the language of our hearts. And for that reason, we'll be providing simultaneous interpretation in both English and Spanish. I'm going to explain how to go ahead and set up the Spanish interpretation for those of you who'd prefer it. Buenas tardes, como dije, mi nombre es Ali y en estas sesiones tenemos un compromiso con lo que se llama la justicia del lenguaje. Queremos que todo el mundo pueda participar y expresarse plenamente en el idioma preferido o llamado lenguaje del corazón. Por lo tanto, probemos interpretación simultánea en inglés y español. En un par de minutos verán un globo terráqueo que aparece en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Y al hacer clic en este globo pueden seleccionar el idioma en el que prefieren participar. Para los usuarios de celulares o tabletas, estas opciones se encuentran presionando en los tres puntos y yendo al menú de más opciones. As a reminder, please do be aware of your speed and your clarity while speaking. Please remain on mute while not speaking, and we'll do our best to minimize any sort of background noise. Thank you so much. We can turn on interpretation now. Ya vamos a iniciar la interpretación.
Thank you, Ali.
Interpretation is available.
All right. So final conversation here, at least for the moment. I want to thank Erica. I would thank Minsun in person if she were here. She will be back in action shortly, I am sure, after a visit back home in South Korea. Tom and Candace from Chernobyl have been great backing us up and helping us figure out how to put this show on. And now, as we've mentioned, the recordings are all on YouTube, so you can go back and review anything you might have missed. And if you have other questions or thoughts, of course, drop them in the chat, and we will try to get them a little later on today. I want to introduce Aaron Dawson of the Industrial Commons, which is an organization that many of us have been watching for a while. You know, maybe Aaron would agree they're like an overnight success after only 10 years, right? Or maybe a little more than 10 years. It's just the most amazing, wonderful project. And they lately won a very sizable award, in our world, a very sizable award to do some great work, which I will let Aaron tell you more about. But one of the reasons I wanted Aaron to chime in here is because in this proposition of creating social co-ops, the theory that I'm working on, and I may have to revise it, but my idea is that social co-ops seem different in several ways, but one of them is, you know, a worker co-op usually is a kind of a standalone enterprise, whether it's a bakery or a taxi service or whatever it might be. And as you look more closely, it seems that social co-ops, in many ways, being multi-stakeholder, are almost more like creating a little ecosystem. It's a more complicated, you know, little machine than simply a straightforward commercial LLC, even if it's a worker co-op. So, in other words, this ecosystem question, it takes us to sort of some new challenges. And if you look at it on a grand scale, the industrial commons is a model of ecosystem which is not only community-wide, it's regional. It reaches out across a whole section of Western North Carolina, which is just remarkable. So that's taken quite a long time to do. There are many different parts within the industrial commons, which I want Aaron to tell us a little bit about as well. But it is an inspiring model. I think it certainly has elements of social co-ops in it, even though there's nothing really formally like that. Hopefully, he might say something about that. And I'm looking forward to everything Aaron's got to tell us today. Aaron, welcome.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here. And yes, I think there is some overlap. And I'll just know May was a very busy month, so I was not able to sign up for the previous social co-op workshops. But I did go back and watch just the other day, just yesterday and today, the first one, just to kind of get my head around what you all have been learning about and what has been defined as a social co-op. And I think there is some overlap, and there's some just some interesting things to think about, both, from an ecosystem, as I think you were rightly saying, but also from a worker co-op perspective and in the United States. So I think there's some interesting layers that I'll kind of touch on. Um, if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen if I have the ability to. It looks like I do. And I will start the slideshow. Briefly, looks like I have some light glare. Sorry about that. Briefly about myself. I don't know if I can do anything about that light glare, but I have been at the Industrial Commons since 2018, so 6 years now. It is the organization itself is probably 10 years old, but you'll learn, as you'll learn shortly. At first, we created the 501c3, the nonprofit, to just kind of take in a grant, and that was it, right? Someone's like, yeah, we'd love to give you money, but you need to be a 501c3. And so for a few years, it was kind of very quiet. But I was one of the first full-time employees, actually. Even though I am remote, I live in about 2 hours east in the Chapel Hill region of North Carolina. And we have, as noted, when I was the first employee with, a $50,000 budget. Now we're over 30 employees and a $15 million budget 6 years later. So that is a ramp up, and I'll show you some stats on that at the end. But before that, I worked at Equal Exchange for 15 years. So I was a worker owner at Equal Exchange. I was the worker owner coordinator for 2 years early on in my career, and then I was on the board of directors for 6 years and chair of the board for one of those years. And I did the Masters in Cooperative Management program through St. Mary's. So a lot of co-op, a lot of worker co-op history, experience, and know. So it's been fun to kind of apply it to a different setting. So that's enough about me. I have to say, I do love our tagline here, right? Rebuilding a diverse working class based on locally rooted wealth. And that tagline is just so indicative of where we came from and where we are, right? So where are we? We're in Western North Carolina. 1 in 5 people still work in manufacturing. 1 in 6 people did not graduate high school. Even though we have a ton of manufacturing in Western North Carolina, here we are over here, Burke County. The median household income is 23% lower. Minimum wage in North Carolina is $7.25. It vies with South Carolina for one of the least unionized states in the country. And we do textile. We are part of a large movement of, companies moving south to avoid unions and keeping it that way, right? Poverty rate 20% higher, and yet our labor unemployment rates are hovering around 2.8, much like the country. What I've said about this part of North Carolina is it is very indicative of the current economy. When I lived in Massachusetts and we had the Great Recession in 2008, many people were still employed, not in Western North Carolina. Western North Carolina, I think the national unemployment rate was 8%. Western North Carolina was like at least 14% unemployment rates during 2008, 2009. And so you go back to this tagline focused on rebuilding a diverse working class based on locally rooted wealth. And it's specifically because, and it started with NAFTA, when textile companies and furniture manufacturing, when that agreement was signed, within a year, those companies were sourcing their work elsewhere, out of country. All right. And then 2008 was just another nail in that coffin, where a lot of these companies either closed or relocated. And so our two founders, Molly and Sarah, right here. Sarah's on the left and Molly's on the right. They are both born and raised in Burke County, born and raised in Morganton. They are from the area. They were here in 1993. They were here in 2008. They saw those jobs leave. And so they want to rebuild jobs, economies in Western North Carolina that are locally rooted. And one of the best ways to locally root wealth is by making it employee owned. Because if the employees work there, if the employees live there and they work there and they own it, well, the chances of them outsourcing their labor goes down a bit, right? And not to mention, I'm sure you've heard or learned, employee-owned companies are more resilient during economic downturns as well. So it really, and I think the origin story is really important, and it does get to this overlap with social co-ops, because it was Molly Hemstreet in 2008 teaching English as a second language. And just to note, she and her husband had worked on a labor struggle with a local chicken processing plant, so there was some labor ties. It's a great book called The Mayas of Morganton if you ever want to read about that experience. It's an amazing book. But she was teaching English as a second language. The folks in her classes were having a terrible time focusing and staying present. And when she was talking to them, it was clear that they didn't have stable jobs, they didn't have stable incomes, they didn't have stable hours. And so when you talk about social co-ops as being part of, working with populations that may be, I forget, Elias, maybe you could kind of remind me the definition of social co-ops, or like kind of who they're working with or what they're doing.
Yeah. Minson suggested maybe we have three elements in a social co-op to simplify it. One is that it's about community benefit, not only the workers, but the community. It's outward facing. And number two, it is working with marginalized communities. And number three, it's democratically governed. So that's kind of a quick shorthand definition.
Okay. And just think of our name, the Industrial Commons, right? That is more than just the one worker co-op. But it didn't start with the Industrial Commons. It started with Molly having mentors both in the textile industry and the worker co-op movement. Frank Adams, who some of you all may know, was one of Molly's mentors. He was actually one of my father's mentors as well. So Frank Adams and the head of the Manufacturing Solutions Center, which is a textile innovation center through NC State, both friends with Molly, both said, you should start a cut and sew factory. Frank Adams said you should make it worker owned. Dan St. Louis said it should be cut and sew, because while the margins may be low, if you do your job really well, you can eke out enough margins to pay people well and make good jobs, right? So Molly Hemstreet, who graduated from Duke in a degree of biology, maybe, teaching English as a second language, doing certainly doing a fair amount of rural organizing through the worker center, which is something I also heard mentioned in the first presentation. They brought up worker centers. Through the local worker center, bought a few sewing machines, and started gathering a few folks she knew and trusted to start a cut and sew factory. So cut and sew is, you're a brand. Let's say Nike, for example, or let's use Maggie's Organics, right? You make t-shirts, you sell t-shirts, but you need someone to cut the fabric and sew it together. That's what the cut and sew does. So you buy the raw materials and send it to Opportunity Threads, and they cut it up and they sew it, and they sew your sticker on the label on there, and then it gets sold. It gets sent back to you to sell. So that's what the cut and sew factory was. That's Opportunity Threads. And pretty quickly, through a lot of hard work, blood, sweat, and tears on behalf of Molly and the other founders, they started getting really, really successful. About that time was when Sarah Chester started working for the local economic development corporation, Burke Development Incorporated. And her job was to get young people in the area to be thinking about staying in the area. And so exposing them to opportunities, educational and employment opportunities in Burke County. And so she would take people, young people, on tours of all the local factories, including Opportunity Threads. And she was like, what is going on with Opportunity Threads? Because all these other factories we tour, people won't look you in the eyes. The lighting is dark. No one wants to talk to you. Opportunity Threads, everyone's hard at work. They're looking at you. And the other thing about Opportunity Threads that's different, and still to this day, it's the same, is that the median age is in the 20s and 30s, not the 50s and 60s, right? The other thing about Opportunity Threads is, in part through the labor organizing that her and her husband did with the chicken processing plant, there were a lot of folks from the Guatemalan community that, again, Mayas of Morganton, read the book. You can learn all about it. But it was, so again, a large, younger Guatemalan American population smiling, saying hello, right? And so she started working more closely with Molly, just as they start getting busier and busier and starting to have to turn away jobs, right? They're getting so much inquiry around jobs that she has to turn them away. And she said, gosh, I'd really like to not turn away these job opportunities and have them go who knows where, when I know there are other manufacturers in North Carolina, textile manufacturers in North Carolina, that might be able to do the gig. So working with Sarah, working with Burke Development Incorporated, they created what was called Carolina Textile District, which is still around today, and it's a membership organization where textile manufacturers in largely the Carolinas, but US-based textile manufacturers have teamed up to kind of share resources. But one of the first things they actually did was they hired an intake coordinator who, if you couldn't take a job at Opportunity Threads, you would send it to the Carolina Textile District, and that Carolina Textile District person would suss out what the job was and put it out to the other textile manufacturers and say, hey, OT doesn't have the capacity. Does anyone else have the capacity and want to take this job on? Right. So I guess, I want to make explicit what may be implicit in what's going to be a theme in this presentation, which is everything that has been done in our ecosystem has been a solution to a problem that we see, right? It's an entrepreneurial way of thinking about things. Okay, we need jobs and we need stable jobs. Okay, a cut and sew factory can provide stable jobs if you do the job well. Again, employee ownership lends itself to that. Okay, we're getting too much work, but we want to keep that work in the Carolinas. We're going to create the Carolina Textile District. So from that, we have this great ecosystem. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our other operations, like Good Books, which is our bookkeeping cooperative, Material Return, which is the waste reclamation and textile remanufacturing company. Touched on Carolina Textile District a little bit. Opportunity Threads, I'll talk about. But we also have nonprofit programs through the Industrial Commons that work on a community level. Like Work in Burke actually is a way to, again, that same program Sarah was working on 10 years ago, to promote local jobs and local education opportunities so that our rural youth don't leave. And TOSS is an amazing, if you ever come visit, it's my favorite part of the tour. TOSS is the community art space. We have after school programs. Right now, we've got a summer camp going on. And so in the corner of our manufacturing warehouse, you have this little art room where you've got like 10 to 15 kids doing art using like old fabrics and old yarns that we've dead stock that we've saved. And so this is kind of the ecosystem at large, right? And again, there's one guy, I think in our county, Catherine, who's right next door, could tell me there's like one art teacher for 14 schools in our district. One. So what does Catherine do as part of TOSS? She every week is going to different schools herself, just as part of the nonprofit, right? So when you think about social co-ops, it's like, what does the community need? What can't the community necessarily afford? How can these organizations, these ecosystems, which are based both on the needs of their enterprises, but also the needs of their communities, meet these needs, right? So I touched on Opportunity Threads. They're, again, founded around 2008, 2009. Molly through the worker center in a fact, in a closet with a couple sewing machines. They're now over 40 workers, over 25 worker owners. They are in a 30,000 square foot facility that they bought 90% cash down. All right. So they had the cash on hand to be able to buy this factory right here that they're standing in front of. Maricela is the head of manufacturing and production. Was the woman on the chicken processing plant when a pregnant woman needed to use the bathroom, she would just stop the line, right? She'd say, stop the line. They weren't allowed to take bathroom breaks. She would be the one. So powerful leaders, smart, incredibly brave people who have built and owned this factory together. So the other, I think really important note is they have around a 90% retention rate, which for sewists, most sewists in our region, if you offer them another quarter per hour, they'll go with you. So that retention and loyalty is important. And their error rate is below 1%. So it's something like 0.3%. And again, this is, just my pitch on worker-owned cooperatives, employee ownership. These things don't guarantee you get those results, but they certainly help encourage it, right? If you are an owner of your company, if you are a worker owners treat their employees or their worker owners different than a regular manufacturer. They treat their clients different as well. Right. The type of work they're doing, a lot of their work is you tend in a bunch of your old t-shirts of your son who's now going to high school, and you have a bunch of high school jerseys. They cut it up and they turn it into a blanket and send it back to you. They can't mess up. They ruin one of your t-shirts, they ruin a memory, right? Again, that doesn't mean that worker co-op guarantees that kind of quality, but I think it really does encourage it. So I'm ignoring comments so I can get through the presentation so I can take more questions. I hope that's okay. If there's anything really important, Elias, just flag me and I can answer it. But so opportunity threads. Okay, so we talked about the Carolina Textile District came from them getting too much work. So I've already touched on that. So what happens right around 2018, right when I start working there, so actually, just going back, Carolina Textile District in part becomes very successful and is starting to organize the manufacturers in our region. And the Appalachian Regional Commission says, we really want to continue the great work that you're doing, but we can't give you a grant because you're organized as an LLC. And so we would love for you, ARC is the Appalachian Regional Commission, we would love to continue your work, sponsor your work, but please, we'd need it to be in the form of 501c3 nonprofit. So that's how the Industrial Commons was born. Again, from a need to receive grant funding. So originally it was just to kind of continue that work, but around shortly after, that was like 2015, around 2017, 2018, Molly and Sarah, who've been working together and kind of partnered on this Industrial Commons nonprofit, start realizing that it doesn't just have to be a passive way to receive income. It can really be a way to build out this economic engine, be this ecosystem amplifier or incubator, rather. And at the same time, the textile waste company that was picking up their textile waste at Opportunity Threads and sending it to a recycler, selling it to a recycler, said there's no money in recycling textile waste anymore, so we're going to stop picking up. We can pick up and send it in a landfill, but we're not going to recycle it anymore. And so that's when Molly said, you know what? We know the textile companies in our region. We know the waste cycle in our region. We can do that work. So that's when they started Material Return. And again, in part using grant funding to help incubate it. And what started as just picking up textile waste and making sure it got recycled. Very quickly, they realized, again, through industry experts that are friends of ours, like Dan St. Louis, that actually, a lot of times when you recycle textile waste, it gets turned into like the lining in your car, or like if you receive any of those food prep meal kits, sometimes there's like a fabric So that's called downcycling. But they realize there's a real opportunity to upcycle, and that is take textile waste, combine it with virgin materials like wool or cotton, and turn it back into a new yarn. And so again, we had the opportunity through the Appalachian Regional Commission for $1 million grant to buy a machine that takes the chopped up textile waste and recombines it into a raw ingredient that can be turned into yarn based on old products. So for example, you can go on to Smart Wool Second Cut right now. Smart Wool, if you just Google Smart Wool Second Cut, you can fill out your address. They'll send you a environmentally recyclable plastic bag that you can put your old socks in, and it can come to us. And then we take those socks and we sort it out. If you've got Smart Wool socks, we put it in a separate pile. We have it all chopped up. That chopped up Smart Wool sock stuff and the other socks come back to us. And then we combine it with Smart Wool's virgin wool that they use. And you can go online and also buy a Smart Wool Second Cut sock. And that sock is made from old socks, right? So that's how we're taking textile waste, old socks, chopping it up, turning it into new socks. So I think, so that's an example of we saw an opportunity and we went for it. The other need we have, not only internally for our enterprises, but also externally in our community, is a bookkeeping cooperative. So we did found a bookkeeping cooperative. It is bilingual bookkeeping cooperative, women-led, women-owned. Charlet is the general manager, and Marcelina is the manager underneath Charlet. Jojo just recently left, so we did just hire someone new. But they, they perform the bookkeeping services again internally and externally. Actually, they're so they provide services in around the state and actually the country. So last but not least, just some metrics. We have 4 enterprises right now: Opportunity Threads, Good Books, Material Return, and Carolina Textile District. Over the years, we've created 85 jobs. The one thing I didn't mention is we are currently building a innovation campus. So this is just another example of just like where we come from. A pretty red area. I think it's something like 70% of voters in Burke County voted for Trump in 2020. Yeah, in 2020. Our Republican local representative put in a rider for the 2024 budget for $5 million of development funds to develop our campus, right? So working with our local legislators, going across the lines to get funding to build something that I think is not a Democrat or Republican issue. It's going to create good jobs in our region. It's going to be an innovation campus. It's just under 40 acres. And we're also building out on an adjacent lot community a land housing co-op on an adjacent. Again, right now we're just east of Asheville. Housing crisis is hitting, much like it's already hit Asheville for sure. And so providing affordable housing to our community members is another thing we're trying to do. We didn't want to get into housing, but it became clear we couldn't avoid it because that's what the community needed. Just like, this is revenue plus plus assets. So this is revenue over the years plus assets. So we do have, something like $20 million to help build out the campus, the campus property itself, plus the revenue that our co-ops like Opportunity Threads and Material Return are generating. Yeah. So that's my last slide. How'd I do, Elias? Did I take too much time? I don't know how much time I had.
No, that's great. If you need a little bit more, go ahead and finish up whatever you want to say. This is great.
Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing and just kind of just thinking about social cooperatives and thinking about what we have in the US. So I do really, after watching that, I think social co-ops are a real opportunity in the US. I just get the sense that, co-ops have been kind of a big funding opportunity in the last 10 years. I think Democracy at Work Institute has done, in other organizations, but Dowie in particular has done a really good job of raising the profile of employee ownership and getting our name and our movement out to funders. I think social co-ops, to me, feels like a trend that's just waiting to happen. And I say that because I think it combines some of the aspects, this democratic and community control, with, market failures. So I did, again, the first webinar you all did is fresh in my mind because I watched it like yesterday. Noting that things like manufacturing production are probably not a good thing for a social co-op. I agree. I agree, not just from kind of not just kind of like a technical standpoint, but I also, and this is kind of the place where I feel is an interesting, okay, so working at Equal Exchange for 15 years, it was really empowering to be a worker owner of a profitable co-op, right? Some years I would get 1,000, some years I would get 5,000. One year I got $8,000 in patronage, right? My share of the profits was $8,000 at Equal Exchange. Now, Equal Exchange was a very successful co-op. But I guess my point is there's a lot of pride in being independent, right? And not needing a government subsidy or not needing a nonprofit subsidy in order to survive, right? And so where possible, I think we nonprofits, if they are in the business of incubating, should really be working on incubating freestanding, profitable cooperative enterprises. I think that, that's a way to ensure, uh, some kind of insulation from the whims of politicians and funders. That said, I think there are some places, and I hear from people all the time, I've got a bunch of day laborers and maybe we should I'd like to organize them as a worker co-op. And what I worry about is setting people up for an expectation that you're going to own something that's going to be profitable and it's going to be freestanding and independent. And what I like about social co-ops is it takes a little bit of that expectation. I don't know how else to say. I mean, like I saw in that presentation, like Greece, you're not allowed to share surplus, right? And so it takes the kind of expectation of like, I'm an owner and I get to own this and it's mine and I'm going to be profitable and I'm going to make money off of it. But it emphasizes still the community ownership, the community investment, and the democratic control components, which I think in certain areas where if it cannot be a profitable enterprise, don't promise low-income people that they can own something where they'll be profitable. That just feels irresponsible. But if you say, hey, this is a community good, right? It's supporting our community, it's part of the ecosystem. I think as we don't have any plans as of yet to do kind of a social co-op in our ecosystem, but it does feel like a real opportunity. That said, what we have done through the nonprofit is done things like the community art space, and where we are providing technical expertise and assistance to our worker co-ops, which again, in the textile industry, they're a reason why a lot of companies offshored. It's really hard the razor thin profit margins. All right. So if we can provide the technical assistance, I've done trainings for our for-profit worker co-ops on management training, how to be a good manager, open book management training, how to understand financials in your operational organization. We've done executive skill training to understand your executive skills, your strengths and your weaknesses. So this is a way that the nonprofit is able to provide support to our for-profit co-ops, which with our mission is to really hire folks from the front line to bring into hiring people from marginalized communities. Good Books has a whole mission. We have a different pricing for people in our communities, that small businesses who speak a second, whose English is a second language, if they have a second language at all, providing services, bookkeeping services to these small businesses at a subsidized rate. So I think it's where I see the overlap is, what does our community need? We have a functioning enterprise that can help meet those needs, primarily through bringing down grant funding to help support the communities, right? The last thing I'll note is, grantors generally don't love funding a project that can't be replicated, right? That can't be magnified. So like, why don't you go across the country and develop industrial commons around the country? That's a challenge that we face. That's a funding challenge, a messaging challenge. But I think ultimately we've been incredibly successful of creating a model where people see the change we're building in our community. And I guess the last footnote I'll say on that is it's all been through the success of the first worker co-op. So that's the kind of the place I want to return. That's what's helped us be successful we weren't a worker co-op development organization that developed a successful co-op. We had Molly Hemstreet found a successful co-op, which created opportunities to develop an ecosystem around it. And I was just talking to someone the other day, and it's like, don't focus on the bakery, focus on baking your first, sourdough bread. Right? Sourdough is a great example because it's, got the starter bread. Focus on your first sourdough bread before you start building out the bakery. Right? So that's the path we took. It was largely based in our region, based on the skills and the knowledge and experience that is locally found, naturally found in our region, and has all been done through an entrepreneurial bent. Okay, there we go.
That was awesome. That was awesome. It's such an inspiring project, and I'm so happy about all the publicity and recognition and all the rest of it. It's coming after all this hard work and incredible creativity. I love your final comments because it sounds like you are picking up, Aaron, on, even though you just caught the first episode, you're picking up on that there's something different about the kind of workplace philosophy, the workplace dynamic inside a social co-op as opposed to a worker co-op. Matthew just came back from Italy, where there's a bunch of social co-ops some months ago. I want to give him a chance to give his thoughts on the way you were framing that and kind of our angle on it. Matthew?
Sure. Yeah, happy to take a stab at that. Thanks so much, Aaron. And yeah, always so inspiring to hear about what you all are doing in Industrial Commons, and that you paint it in such a way that it feels so accessible also. That like you tell very well the story of like humble beginnings and conditions that I think are so relatable to all of us. Of like, we see folks who are like in positions like working in the chicken plant. That's actually like quite related to my personal location here in Athens, Georgia, where like one of our major employers is a poultry plant. And we've been talking for a long time as a community of like, how do we help lift folks up in a way that does feel like sustainable, and yet also has to build in those blood, sweat, and tears to like build an engine and then start to identify meet need, and kind of continue that chain up into those like higher scales that you're kind of talking about. So just wanted to lift that up, that I just love, that I think so many of us are starting in those more humble positions right now. And I feel like kind of like the social co-op movement in and of itself feels a little bit like that in the United States, like we're starting from a humble position, yet we know from like looking at these other examples like Emilia Romagna, they were also in sort of similar situations if we step back a couple of decades. And, pre-1991, when like the social co-op legislation passed in Italy, how much that feels like kind of where we are today, where like grassroots groups are experimenting, they're showing success, looking toward a bit more replication and thus recognition. If we start to talk about bringing things down, whether it's grant dollars or bringing down like legislation that like recognizes what we're doing and that sort of thing. So I was just thinking about, what you were saying about, the way the funders look at like what we're doing and some of the challenges, like not looking replicable, not looking scalable, and how like we've been seeing that kind of play out with like the Elevate Cooperative, which was like one of our other sessions for like home care cooperatives. I'm just curious if you could comment on like how you're seeing the ability to grow up into that sort of like highest level. And what I really just mean is like sort of the national scale, and like how we can federate upward even further. Or like, do you see that potential across these like local experiments? And like, how do you see the timing of that? Do you see like, is it tech, and also is it textiles, you think, that like will ultimately federate upward into that when we think about the social co-op movement.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. Now, I don't know how applicable our situation is to other sectors. And again, I will just state, we're a place-based and sector-based strategy, and I think the place-based strategy allows you to build off of the people you know. And I mean, Dane St. Louis, the text, I think that was the kind of manufacturing solution center, innovation center, that I think that was Molly's swim coach when she was in high school, right? And so you're building off of your social capital, the people you know. And sector-based means that like you then scale up your connections, and so that when you're trying to do something else or something new, all the players, right? So you're not going from like you start a cut and sew factory to you're starting a bicycle engineering, manufacturing company, right? Like you're starting something else in the textile world. So I think that's one piece. Where we've really been able to scale is, and so this was thank you, Elias, again for referencing this, and I'm glad I remember to talk about it, is the National Science Foundation fund that we just won. We're part of the National Science Foundation's Engines grant. And so we got $15 million over the next 2 years to take what's called the circular economy. Folks may be familiar with that term, but again, that term is you're manufacturing new things out of old things, right? So it's not just recycling, it's quite literally reusing or remanufacturing. And we got the fund, this Engines grant, in part because what we're planning on doing is building on the success of our knowledge and our partnerships. The mission of this grant is to turn southeastern United States, this corridor from Tennessee to North to South Carolina to Georgia, into the place where if you want a circular textile fabric, you come see us, right? And so we were able to leverage our knowledge, skills, and experience. But and if you read anything about the not Build Back Better, sorry, the anti-inflation and the CHIPS Acts and all that, employee ownership, worker co-ops are kind of a note in there. And I think I'm pretty sure we've been told that was one of the things that attracted them to us to them, whatever, was the fact that we are working in a employee ownership space. But so we're scaling through our sector. That's how we're scaling. I don't know on some of, the challenge with so a little bit of background. My father, Steve Dawson, was, the first executive director of the ICA group in Boston, Massachusetts, and worked very closely with Rick Serpin to help found CHCA, and then later formed the nonprofit arm of CHCA. And so he has a lot of experience in the home care world. And I think the challenge there, and that's why I think social co-ops are an interesting thing, is like it is incredibly hard to do two things: make a profit and pay people better, right? And so I don't know. Yeah, I don't know enough about policy. I just think, is there what can we do to take these low paid jobs and offer more competitive pay without increasing the cost to a point where people won't use it? And I think there's some question, like, that's not my sector, it's not my world. But I think scalability would be around something around policy or leveraging foundations to help support that work. That's my total amateur answer on that kind of world. Just we've been able to leverage it on this innovation kind of sphere.
I'll just say quickly, and then I want to get to Brian's question. I've been really fascinated with the way in which, in the Italian context, social co-ops are presented not just as a way to execute government grants around social care. Social co-ops sort of present themselves as innovators, entrepreneurial, agile. Their pitch is, if you let us do this work, we're going to come up with solutions, and we're going to come up with ways of delivering but are much more creative than the typical government agency or other kind of professional agency in our community might come up with, which is really interesting. I think about this when I look at material return and the kind of innovation that you're doing there in terms of the circular economy. But that's very much part of the social co-op mentality too. It isn't just, care provision of the usual kind of generic kind, which is really very interesting the way they go at this in Italy. Brian had a question about the way the parts of the system fit together, how they coordinate.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull up a slide and see if I think I saw Stephen note that a chart helps. Now I guess the other caveat, and I try to say this in every presentation, I feel like we're well established and we still have a ton to prove. So Opportunity Threads, again, a very successful ongoing concern. Our projects like Material Return, they're newer, they're more experimental, right? And so we still have yet to completely prove out that model in that way. And so alongside of that, because they're still in incubation mode, we're just now kind of getting to the okay, well, what really is the structure? What is the governance? And so we've been working with ICA Group. I should sign a conflict of interest form. But actually it wasn't. It was the team that chose this organization, and we're going to work on our management structure. And now they're going to be working with us on our governance structure. So what I'm going to show you is a snapshot of where we are kind of hoping to go. And this may change, right? So, okay, is this the right one? No, maybe not. Okay, yeah. So there it is. So, we've got the nonprofit that is kind of the primary shareholder in a public benefit corporation, which has a board that oversees these three enterprises. This enterprise actually is kind of in hibernation right now. It was not big enough, and we're kind of putting on ice for a little bit. It was had one employee, didn't fully work out, and so he actually was from Material Return, and he's now back at Material Return. So just another example of an ecosystem of trying new things and absorbing employees so that, folks don't lose their jobs if the thing doesn't work. Anyway, so the goal here is what we are still on the precipice of building out is we have this board here. It meets once a year, but it's not really active. And then each of these enterprises has their own board, right? And so and then those board members send representatives up to this public benefits board, which also has nonprofit representation board members. The co-ops themselves have obviously a lot of power in decision making, unless they wanted to sell the co-op. That's one of the things that the Public Benefits Corporation board can kind of lean in and say, they have kind of the golden share on that kind of decision making. Carolina Textile District, as I mentioned, is kind of a membership organization, so they have a membership board. And then a lot of our this is our 501c3. We have 2 workers from the organization on our board. So two workers from our ecosystem on the board, as well as 7 other outside board members. And then our programs like the TOS, and we have a community engagement, which is kind of like doing diversity, equity, inclusion work. They have advisory committees that are kind of acting as like a advisory board from our community in order to better help us make sure that the way we work is in line with what our community wants and needs. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Again, these Material Return has like 5 employees and only 3 of them have been here for more than 2 years. Good Books, we have 2 employees, just added a 3rd. So the goal is at the end of this summer to really have a better real understanding of what membership means. And we are working on creating a parallel membership track for the nonprofit. Again, the nonprofit, I helped write the protocol for the nonprofit, all nonprofit workers to vote on who their representative in the nonprofit board would be. So yeah. I don't know if that helps or hurts, but that's kind of what we're going with right now.
That's an awesome chart. I mean, and part of what we need to build, what we need to be thinking about is the sort of umbrella organizations that would know how to put those pieces together. So individual groups of workers wouldn't have to figure this out all over again every time, right? What you're developing there is one of the templates, maybe one of the best ones I've ever seen for the next level up, the system that supports the folks below it, right? I want to ask Tom Llewellyn if he has any thoughts on what we've been hearing here based on his experience with Shareable.
Yeah, thanks, Elias. Well, Shareable, we've been a big fan of Industrial Commons for a while. Published a story a few years ago, I think, about your work. And I was actually a co-founder of the Asheville Tool Library at the same time that Industrial Commons was getting started, and had no idea that was happening back when I was living in Asheville. So it's just great to see the larger Western North Carolina ecosystem building out and being successful, along with, there's a great network, I think, of just general worker co-ops and mutual aid groups and kind of social economy that's been burgeoning and now flourishing in Western North Carolina. So it's just good to hear that. And I think that it's the ecosystem approach, as we were just saying, seems to be one of the most dynamic and supportive systems for not just starting and incubating projects, but being able to maintain them, right? And because there can be a lot of energy initially when things are getting started, but the maintaining those systems over time is very difficult. And having a supportive ecosystem around it can really enable that long-term success. And I think that doesn't necessarily have to be local, right? I mean, I think that's the one things we've been talking about with social co-ops, is that there can be that larger umbrella kind of enabling network which supports the growth and of individual social co-ops that are not in a specific region together, but are linked by common goals and interests and a desire to see the larger success of kind of this new area. So that's the other thing I think about the need for local, and you made really great points about what can be done when you're really hyper local. But when there is not necessarily a specific place where everyone's starting, I think you can get a lot of those same benefits through larger networks.
Yep.
Elias, can I just jump on one thing? I'd be remiss, and Stephen noted in the comments that we work very closely with Poderema, and I just think, everyone's got an ecosystem crush, and Poderema is my ecosystem crush. I just how they've built out an incredibly not complex, but interconnected governance system that kind of signals down thinking for policies and then gets approved and sent back up. They've got mobile home, manufactured home cooperative. So that's housing co-ops, as well as worker co-op maintenance, worker co-op, interpretation co-op. And they're right up the mountain. They're 45 minutes away from us. And so we've worked together. Just 3 weeks ago, Alon from Poderema and I delivered a 2-day supervisor and coaching methods training to both their ecosystem and our ecosystem, right? And so I helped them implement open book management in Sensontle, and then they took open book management and implemented it. So our two ecosystems are also highly collaborative. I had a meeting on my drive up with Andrea from Poderema this morning. So that's just the other kind of to that point, that network, we've been able to combine a lot of resources to bring a lot of skills to our communities. Yeah.
That's great. Our colleague Cindy Lou has a couple of questions. The first one being, let me find it here. Yeah, on the public facing branding and the marketing, there is something to say here because I remember Molly talking about it. How do you guys kind of manage the public face of this project living where you are?
Yeah, so we've had, you know, for being in a kind of rural Western North Carolina, we've had some amazing designers. So I love our design. I'll just say that. I will say Molly. So again, in the cut and sew world, and also what we're doing, developing yarns, it's really easy to either bury the story or the company that's producing the stuff, or really take it and make it your own, and like make our hard work and great ethics a part of your story and not a part of our story. So Molly has really hammered hard on the companies that we work with. Like if you go to the Smart Wool Second Cut video, they spend a minute talking about material return, right? And so really pushing on the brands that we're working with to say, don't steal our story and don't cut us out of our story. And again, Smart Wool has been amazing at that. They've been really totally happy to share that story, but just fighting for that. So that's one way, is kind of using, because we're business to business, we're not business to consumer, right? So using those business consumer machines to make sure that they don't leave us out or extract our message without really making sure that we get back from it. And I did see the question. So that's how I would say, kind of, and then, you know, newsletters and all that stuff. But I think that's been a really powerful part. And then the administrative costs, taxes, bylaws to manage the machine. You know, we're a nonprofit, and so that's one of the advantages of the nonprofit, is that you can not, you can kind of absorb some of those tax issues. And by being a nonprofit, you can raise funds to help support things around buying laws. We do work with a wonderful lawyer, Steve Virgil, who's been really wonderful in working with us. I think we've gotten very competitive rates working with him, and he's just been lockstep beside us the whole time. I don't know if that gets to all of it, but I would just say kind of like the nonprofit helps support some of those administrative costs and grant funding.
I'll grab Derek's question here real quick. There are international organizations like the International Cooperative Alliance, but in terms of what we're talking about in this context, I was thinking about the Italian model of using consortia, as they call them, which are back-end support member-led organizations that you join and pay a yearly percentage to, in order to essentially get their technical support, legal support, even funding leads to get into business. This we don't have, not yet. But this is part of the research that Mansoon and Matthew and I and some other folks are working on, is trying to figure out how do they do this in Italy, Quebec, South Korea, other places, to make all this work much easier. I'm sure everybody sitting here is thinking, what an amazing amount of labor had to go into this industrial commons project to get it to this point. It's just incredible. I mean, also the intentionality. When you visit this place, which I had the good fortune to do about a year and a half ago, it's really wonderful the way they have thought through every single corner of the operation. It's really nothing like it. So that's great, but imagine the amount of work it took to do that. So we got to make it easier, right? We just have to find a way to make it easier.
Can I just, I know
Anybody
we
else
have to,
want to- Yeah.
oh, can I
go
just
ahead.
wrap one last note? And I really appreciated Matthew saying this, is, and kind of to your point as well. I mean, I think people, politicians, city council people, organizations, nonprofits go to Mondragon and they're like, okay, I want a Microsoft backed R&D, and I want a, you know, multi-million-dollar grocery store hybrid cooperative. And they see the Mondragon of 2024 and they go, that's what I want in my community. We can't learn from that. That is like 60 years well beyond where our capacity is at. It's what did Father Arizmendiata do
Exactly.
in 1954? He went door to door to raise money for a technical school. He
Yep.
started very, very community-based and very, very grassroots to build something that the community needed. They needed a skilled building community college or technical college. So I would just really, he may have had lofty utopianistic view ideal goals, but he started with something very concrete. And I just like dream big, start, concrete.
Beautiful. Yes. That's great. All right, we're going to wrap up in just a second. I just want to remind everybody we're not quite shutting down. We have your email addresses. We're going to be back to you after a little summer break. And the next topic will be, how do we keep this momentum going and begin to dig in a little bit deeper now that we've heard from all these wonderful presenters like Aaron. And the way we're going to go at that is by creating a community of practice where once a month, we just get together and kind of talk about what's working. And we're going to try to figure out a way to have sort of like two conversations at the same time, unless we have to break them off into two separate conversations. And that is, one is about social co-ops and continuing on discussing the mechanics and the structures of that effort. And then we've also got the sector conversations around childcare, elder care, disabled care, immigrant services, and more, and much more, as you get into this and discover all the ways in which these community-facing social co-ops can operate. It's just, remarkable. So we'll have to manage that two-level conversation, which I think we will do. But I just want to promise we will be back to you. And if anybody else has any final thoughts on this journey, feel free to chime in. Thank you, Erica, by the way, for the great job you did. I wish Sun were here, but we'll get to her when we see her again. Anybody?
Thank you,
All good?
Elias. So,
A pleasure. It's been great fun. We've got a lot of stuff in motion here that we started with this conversation. It's going to be great to follow up and do more. So unless we have any other comments, you'll be hearing from us a little later on in the summer. And thank you all. This has been very exciting. Okay. Ciao. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Aaron. That was great.
Oh, thank you, Elias. Yeah, wonderful. Happy to do it. Happy to talk to you.